and welcome to this home edition of Politics Today. And in this program today, we'll be discussing, is America retreating from the world under President Biden? And to join me in this program today, I'm joined by Michael McCann, who's the director of Israel-Britain Alliance, together with Donald Boyd, who represents the Scottish Christian Party. So gentlemen, welcome to the program. And I'll start off with you, Michael. What are your thoughts on the fact that we've heard the latest foreign policy announcement by Biden that he is planning to withdraw all US forces from Afghanistan on the 11th of September this year, and now has announced he's pulling out all US military operations in Iraq against ISIS. What are your thoughts on these policies, and are we heading into a new era of danger as we see America retreating from the world?
We may very well be, Simon. I think if anyone looks at the history of the recent history of America's adventures overseas, there have been some notable calamities, notably Vietnam and the South Americas with the Contra investigation during Ronald Reagan's time. But I think the difference between those adventures and the recent involvement in both Afghanistan and Iraq is that America was attacked. American people were attacked when the two airplanes struck the Twin Towers in 9/11. And there is also a danger that they forget about why they were involved, because the situation was allowed to develop where Afghanistan was being used as a base by Osama bin Laden, and they wanted to stop that happening, and they did that successfully. And then when they when they were involved in Iraq in terms of weapons of mass destruction, some people like to look back as if they had 20/20 vision. One of the things that I mentioned and in fact during the debate in the House of Commons, is that the one person who didn't deny that he had weapons of mass destruction was Saddam Hussein. He wanted his neighbours, he wanted the world to believe that he had these weapons in order that he could control both his territory and frighten the territories around him. So I think sometimes people look back with rose-tinted spectacles and think that they had all the answers when these things were taking place. And we should also remember that when Joe Biden was the vice president and they started to withdraw from Iraq, that led to ISIL taking over large parts of the Middle East, the murder of tens of thousands of people, and the murder of both British citizens and American citizens. So I think there's a danger that this is a very short-term move. And the one fundamental thing that I'm concerned with is Joe Biden making these decisions? Or is his mental capability such that there are people behind the scenes who are pulling all the strings? And that genuinely worries me.
And Donald, it's good to have you back on this home edition of Politics Day. It's good to see you. And what are your thoughts on what looks like America's strategic withdrawal from the world and the dangers that would entail with the empowerment of the Taliban, for example, or with his plans to re-engage Iran in the Iran deal? And also his support for the Palestinian Authority. Surely this is seeing that he's actually empowering the enemies of the West at the moment, rather than actually confronting what is essentially the evil that we are seeing in the world today.
That's not only our own view, Simon. Thanks for having us on again. The Russians themselves have complained about the Americans coming out of Afghanistan, that has left a power vacuum. And they are pointing out that this is a failure of leadership of the West. And indeed, it probably is a failure. The state of Joe Biden's mental capacity as the leader of the not-so-free world should concern us. The White House physician, who was not only the physician of Donald Trump, but of George Bush and Barack Obama, has asked him to take a cognitive test, because most people watching his performances are asking themselves whether this man is really up to the job. And like Michael, we have to ask ourselves who's calling the shots. Kamala Harris is unlikely to be the main force. and some people have even suggested that it's still Barack Obama who's the backseat driver. The Iranian situation and the Palestinian situation is a real concern. The inability to really assess what's going on is astonishing. It may help your readers to know that arguments that I've heard with regard to, say, for instance, Hamas, I've heard them say, oh, Hamas has changed its charter. Now, it might be worth your hearers knowing that the change that they've made is simply a bit like the SNP in Scotland. They just want to see a two-state solution as a stepping stone towards what they always wanted and still want, which is to eradicate the state of Israel out of the Middle East. So that if you think in terms of the stepping stone wanting a Scottish Parliament to lead to a separate Scotland, it's the same sort of thinking with Hamas. That their view is still the same, that there should not be a Jewish state in the Middle East. So that the inability to assess the effect of moving out of these things in this part of the world is just leaving a power vacuum, and which Mike has already mentioned, how ISIL stepped into that power vacuum, and we don't really know what will happen.
Michael, it seems like a long time ago that President Trump was in power, but when he was in power, we saw a more stable and peaceful Middle East. We saw that he used, for example, the Kurds and the Iraqi army to defeat ISIS. We saw a dramatic reduction in Islamist terrorist attacks around the world, particularly directed against the West. But it seems that Biden's policy of completely withdrawing from Afghanistan and Iraq and any real strategic involvement in the Middle East is only going to lead to an escalation in terrorism and extremism around the world. Do you think that the world is fully aware of the dangers of allowing the Taliban to gain complete foothold in Afghanistan and for ISIS to re-emerge in Iraq again as a threat not only to the region, but also to the security of the West?
Well, here's the problem with Donald Trump, Simon. Donald Trump made a lot of statements and said a lot of things which were, quite frankly, two stops past barking. And in terms of some of his moral standards, then I don't think he was a very fit for office individual. But one of the areas that he did excel in my opinion, is foreign policy. He managed to get, in complete secrecy, he managed to create circumstances that we have got countries in the Middle East who signed the Abraham Accords, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and others we're told were also in the flight path to secure those deals as well, including Saudi Arabia. And now that's a massive change. And what that was doing, it was isolating, for example, the Palestinian Authority and those ruthless, bloodthirsty terrorists in Hamas. It was isolating them and putting them under real pressure because they saw the natural band of supporters disintegrating behind them. And what we've now seen is that we've had a reinstatement of aid without any give by the Palestinian Authority or the terrorists. They've not made any concessions whatsoever. So that's of a real concern. But there's a real concern for me, which is the Democratic Party and the Republican Party always, at the GOP, always had a fairly standard position in terms of foreign policy in a number of different areas. And we're now seeing that changing because there's been a shift to the left, the hard left in the Democratic Party, with people like Ilhan Omar and others who are in Congress. And there's been a lot of placating their positions when, quite frankly, they should be utterly dismissed. There's a view that comes from the left, and I used to be part of it. I never supported this view, but there was many on the left who think that if you don't annoy anybody, then you won't have any troubles. Well, I'm afraid that the people we're dealing with who are radical Islamists want to change the way we live. They want this country to be a Sharia state. They don't want to see the freedoms that we get on a daily basis. So therefore, what concerns me is that when Americans withdraw from these countries, which have been the hotbeds of radicalism for more than 2 or 3 decades now, then we'll see a return of a new Osama bin Laden coming through. We could see more problems in places like Iraq, particularly with Iran's sinister influence. And the war will be brought back to our shores again. And that's a real concern to me, and should be a real concern to Revelation TV viewers.
And Donald, I've got here in my notes here that Biden, when he was here in July for the G7 summit, spoke so much about creating an alliance of liberal democracies to confront the challenges posed by both China and Russia. But, you know, if we're pulling out American troops from Afghanistan, from Iraq, if we're allowing these most extremist forces to take hold of these dangerous countries in the Middle East, then how is the West, particularly America and Britain, going to confront an aggressive China or an aggressive Russia on the global stage?
Yes, well, he's talking about an alliance, but I don't know what he's doing to form that alliance. You mentioned China and Russia, and as we know, there's been in America, the Republicans have looked upon China as the enemy, and the Democrats are looking upon Russia as the enemy, and these crossed wires between the two of them. We've got to remind ourselves that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, and that whereas there's a role for militarism in defense and in protection of the population, if you're going to fight ideology, which is what Michael was referring to when he talked about the attempt for the aggressive Islamists to impose Sharia law, which is already in place in some parts of Britain. The only way to fight ideology is with ideology, locking them up, putting them in prison, shooting them with guns and bombing them is not going to change them. In fact, it hardens them, and it only convinces them even more that they're in the right, and we are the great Satan. So that very language shows you that we need to be fighting ideology with ideology. But the difficulty is that in the midst of all these arsenals, there is no Christian diplomacy. It's completely absent as far as I can see, unless someone can point it out to me. And what we're needing to do is we're needing to remind people, just as Churchill said, jaw, jaw, instead of war, war. And the upping of the ante on many respects on both sides does not help. And we're needing proper world statesmen, and we can't really think of who they are at the moment. There's nobody bestriding the international scene that is earning the respect of the international community. And in this big vacuum, we've got this president who are not even sure if he understands what's going on around him and is just mouthing other people's policies. Is not the man. And so this is a very uncertain time in international affairs. And as you know, you've got these three big initiatives. I mean, within 50 days, he had executive orders reversing Donald Trump's stuff more than any other president before him within 50 days. And now he's got these three major policies. You've mentioned Nord Stream, the Afghanistan and Iraq, well, Iran as well. So really, is he up to the job? I'm afraid he's not got my vote.
And Michael, I have to say that aren't we seeing a clear departure in US foreign policy, primarily because of the center of previous administrations was the advancement of liberty, the advancement of democracy and freedom, and building democratic institutions, as well as protecting religious liberty. And as far as I can see, I can't see any of these values being pushed forward by the Biden administration, let alone our own government led by Boris Johnson as well.
Well, I think you have to differentiate, Simon, between aims and objectives and hard policies when it comes to this idea of giving democracy to the greater world. There have been Republican and Democrats who have had different views on that. George Bush wanted to follow an isolationist policy. He didn't want to be involved in any foreign affairs. He didn't understand a great deal of it, but he was dragged into it because of 9/11. And then he got involved, if you remember, in the
and the roadmap to peace with the Palestinians, which again failed because the Palestinians don't want peace, and as Donald has rightly pointed out on numerous occasions now and in the past, they want a single Arab state, and they want Israel to be wiped off the face of the earth. So the situation is that whilst there were good and genuine reasons both for involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't take the hindsight argument that we should have known that there were no weapons of mass destruction. For one, Saddam Hussein never said, I have got no weapons of mass destruction. He wanted his opponents and the countries around him to very much believe that he had that type of arsenal and capability. So in terms of what's happened in foreign policy and how America was forced to get involved, I think they made tough decisions, but the right decisions. And one of the things that I would be concerned about if I was a parent of someone who had fallen in Afghanistan or Iraq, whether I was American or British, what was that sacrifice for? Was it for our freedom? Or was it just a blood and treasure war, as unfortunately I think Boris Johnson picked out those unfortunate phrases just a couple of weeks ago. So my view is that they are making a fundamental mistake if they're withdrawing, as the media seems to be suggesting. And I think it could be opening up new dangers, new threats for the UK and for America.
And Donald, what do you think this will mean for these Christians living in these horrendous regimes? I know that many Christians living in Afghanistan are extremely concerned about the advance that the Taliban are making, and particularly with US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the collapse of the Afghan army means that the Christian minorities there will be at the mercy of the Taliban. We also see that America's engagement in Iran is doing nothing to protect the Christians who face incredible persecution. And then the ancient indigenous Christians to the Middle East, particularly Iraq and Syria, have a lot to fear if ISIS then return. And ISIS leaders and fighters are genocidal terrorists who should be up in The Hague for war crimes. And yet what we could see is their re-emergence in the Middle East as well. Do you think enough is being done to protect religious liberties and freedoms, not only in the Middle East, but also in many of these Islamic countries that Biden seems to be cozying up to?
Yeah, the only thing we've heard in the main media is how the translators for the army are going to be left to the inhuman mercy of the other side. And there's been some attempt made to try to help them and their families. But as you say, the Christians are hardly mentioned at all. And yet there have been international reports showing that the persecution, that Christians is the biggest group of people being persecuted around the world. And just to remind your viewers that this ethnic cleansing, which is possibly going to happen as a result of this, has already happened. That from many of these Arab countries after 1948, they were the Jews were ethnically cleansed out of it, and the people who have been in Iraq for literally thousands of years, and they were cleared out of those places, and they had to find their refuge in Israel. So we have a history along those lines that one can look at. It's already documented and should be better known. But what we're talking about here is there's been no strategic plan. We've mentioned that with regard to going into Iraq, that the war was won, but the peace was not won because there was no real strategic planning. And this is the point that what are they going to do? We talk of the translators for the military. You're mentioning the Christians. And we're thinking of this is well, they're not unintended consequences. They're consequences that could be foreseen. But even our mass media is good, Simon, that you're asking these questions. But as you know, the mass media will not ask these questions, and so people are just left there high and dry with no with just having to rely upon their own resources as to how they're going to see their way through the terrible persecution that will come their way.
Michael, when we look at the world in the past 6 months, the world certainly seems a more dangerous and chaotic place. We see really that China is flexing her military muscles, particularly in the South China Sea, against the likes of the Vietnam, against Taiwan, against other nations that are in that vicinity of China, even threatening the Australians as well. Combine this with Russian aggression against Ukraine, and build up of troops and forces on Ukraine's borders, and also the fact that President Biden is empowering the Iranian regime as well as the kind of Palestinian Authority. And at the time, we're seeing that our defense budget is being cut massively in order to deal with COVID. Do you think that the West is prepared for a major confrontation that could come our way if we see these global hotspots continue to get hotter and more dangerous as the months and years approach?
I think it's we're living in dangerous times, as you have rightly pointed out. Are we prepared? The answer to that question has to be no, because we don't appear to have any institutional memory, even a very short institutional memory, in terms of how those most recent events in terms of Afghanistan and Iraq evolved, how we dealt with them. And there were mistakes made, as Donald said. We didn't prepare for the peace. And, you know, I think if you recall back in terms of Iraq, we did win the war, but then we allowed, it was insurgents who, in small groups, in particular Shia militants from Iran, who continued the fighting and created further deaths and further bloodshed in that country. So, you know, are these problems ever resolvable? I think the answer to that, in terms of our experience, is no, because Afghanistan has never been conquered by anybody. And the Russians had a very difficult time in there as well. We can remember, not in the too distant past. But I think what we have to be is that we have to be prepared to deal with any situation that arises. And that's what we have to do. And in terms of the points that you make out about the budget, and China and Russia, they can do whatever they want. They are totalitarian states. They can make decisions to spend 99% of their budgets on weapons arsenals. We can't do that. We live in a democracy, and we've got social security, we've got care of the elderly, and we've got all the other issues that are important to people. But the people don't realise how important these decisions that are made in the Oval Office in the White House, or as we suspect in some of the offices next door, then they're making a really, really fundamental mistake. And I don't think that will we be prepared, or that we are as prepared as we have been in the past, to deal with what might be coming our way. Because one thing is for sure, is that while the press ignore the persecution of Christians and other groups in these countries, they do so because they don't want to be seen to be attacking Muslim countries. It's this whole fear of being accused of being this wokeism, which accuses you of not being fair and of being singling out the Muslims and the Islamic faith. And that's the problem that we have. We're not getting the proper news reported to us, and we may be sleepwalking into future foreign problems in the not too distant future.
Donald, got less than 4 minutes of the programme, but isn't some of the problems that we're facing here in the West is because the West, Britain and the United States in particular, have departed so much from our Judeo-Christian heritage that as nations, we no longer know or see evil when we see it. Therefore, we can't try to rationalize it and not actually confront it as previous generations would have done. And I'm thinking of that brave and courageous generation that fought for our freedoms and liberated Europe from the Nazis during the Second World War.
Yes, it's what's known as judicial blindness, the Lord leaving nations. Remember what the Saviour said. He said, if the blind lead the blind, they'll both fall into the ditch. He never asked anyone to follow blind leaders. And so they both fall in the ditch. And this is what I was meaning, to fight ideology with ideology. That there's been no Christian guidance at the ideological level. If we were to translate that into civil aspects, the word you might use is governance. I noticed that what's been said, that the US will remain behind in order to provide training and support for the Iraqi military, is what was said. But I believe that what we're needing is to teach them governance. There's various ways you can do that, rather than teaching them military lessons which can get used in the wrong way. And this has very often been looked upon as imposing Western values on an unwilling or another culture. But Christian values are not Western values, and governance are not Western values. There are things, they might be identified with the West, but governance is a thing which you hardly ever hear being mentioned as for the training and education of the countries that we do get involved in. We spend 20 years there and we talk about educating girls and sending them to school. But what are we doing about actually teaching how to govern a country and how to, instead of just with bullets and bombs, how you actually govern them, get these principles across, which were certainly once well known. We're losing it in the West, as you know, with the woke agenda. But that arises again because of the inability to bring the Christian ideology to bear upon the secular ideology that we've got in the West, or the Islamic ideology that you've got there in the Middle East.
We're down to about a minute left of the program. So, Michael, a final word to you. I mean, we see that America came to the defense of Europe during the First World War, which tipped the balance in the favor of the British and the West. We see also American intervention in the Second World War, albeit late, actually push back the Nazi influence and also Imperial Japan. And then in the second, in the Cold War, we saw that US forces really did push back the Soviet threat and stabilized Europe and rebuilt Europe after the destruction of World War II. And America, without any values and declining from the world stage, is a real danger, is it not? What are your thoughts on the danger of America no longer being the world superpower?
Well, can I just say, Simon, that just drawing on to the points that you made there, WW1 and WW2, in both occasions, America came late to those wars. They were isolationist. They came in late to the First World War, they came in late to WW2, and so therefore I don't give them all the credit that some people want to give them for that. We stood alone for a long time during WW2. And the lesson that America should take is that when they continually to and fro between isolationism and then getting involved, leads to problems in the world. And if they don't understand that, they're not taking the correct lessons from history.
So, Michael, Donald, thank you so much for being my exceptional guests on this home edition of Politics Today. And I just want to thank you for watching this program today. It's very clear that as Christians, we need to open our eyes and actually see what's happening in the world, to see the dangers that are emerging in the world. And we have a moral responsibility to pray for our governments, that they would pursue righteous legislation and righteous laws, but also as a reminder of how lost our civilization has become when we depart from our Judeo-Christian foundation. And this is the danger that the West is facing today. So thank you for watching this home edition of Politics Today.